Hi, my name is Lily Howard, and for my final project, I decided to study the piece Rhapsody in Blue, composed by George Gershwin. The genre of this piece could be called symphonic jazz orchestral music or orchestral jazz, and that's an interesting genre because it really didn't exist until George Gershwin composed this piece, which is why this piece is so interesting to so many people. The composition was originally written in 1924, and it was composed for a solo piano to be accompanied by a jazz band. And the first performance of this piece actually had George Gershwin himself on the piano, while he was accompanied by 18 other musicians who played a total of 23 instruments. The melody is the most complex component of the piece, so we're going to spend our most time talking about it because it is super complex and it changes throughout the piece. There are varying solos and a combination of themes and motives. Primarily this is led by the solo piano, but Gershwin introduces multiple melodies for us to follow in the piece, and then he'll introduce another one, and then he'll recall one of the melodies he's already introduced, and then he'll combine them all together. I'm going to show you a couple components and a couple sections from the song that I specifically really enjoyed, but what really helped me understand the piece was a critic who broke up the song into 7 different sections. The 7 sections being 1, exposition, 2, the bluesy march, 3, the return of opening theme, 4, the broad tune and development, 5, the cadenza, 6, the quasi recap, and 7, finale. But I'm going to break it down into 4 simpler sections that I really enjoyed, and that is the Latin number, the bluesy march, the speeding train, the piano solo, and the finale. But before we even do that, I'm going to show you the very, very beginning of the song, which is instantly recognizable to people who have heard the piece before, because it is a very recognizable clarinet trill. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of that. Sorry while it loads. So that beginning clarinet trill really starts out by grabbing the audience's attention, which I think really helps with the rest of the piece. Okay, so this next section that I'm going to show you is that Latin number that I described earlier. You can kind of hear the Latin vibes there, a little West Side Story-esque even. The next section I'm going to show you is the bluesy march section that turns into the speeding train section. This is personally my favorite, I think most recognizable to the rest of the piece. You can kind of hear that speeding train rhythm. And then it dies off in a little bit to introduce a new section. And that's into that section. And then the finale, which is very climactic, is led by the pianist. First, the pianist has its own solo. And I'll tell you a fun fact about that solo in a second. So again, you can hear how he kind of uses melodies from earlier, but in a totally different way. So this piano solo goes on and then introduces us to the grand finale, which sounds like this. You can hear how he combines all of the different sections we heard before into the grand finale. And that is the big finish. I encourage you to go listen to the rest of it if you haven't already. It's a very intriguing piece. So yeah, you can see how the melody is complex to categorize since there's so many different elements to it, but that's what makes the Rhapsody in Blue the Rhapsody in Blue. Okay, So harmony. It's primarily the piano / solo instrument leading the melody, while the large jazz band behind them accompanies them and creates that harmony. It combines all 3 different forms of texture that we learned about in the course. There's monophonic texture, there's homophonic texture, and polyphonic texture. There's monophonic texture when there are solo instruments playing, usually the piano / clarinet at the very beginning. The homophonic, it happens when the piano leads the melody while the rest of the jazz band carries out the accompaniment for the majority of the song. And there's also a section that I didn't show you that is led by a solo trumpet, so that's super interesting as well. There's a polyphonic texture added in around 5 minutes in, that bluesy march that I showed you. It dominates the sound, but then as the speeding train element comes in, sound blends together, and then it even has a solo horn joining briefly. So there's a lot of competing melodies in that section specifically that makes it a polyphonic texture. Dynamics. So Gershwin really relies heavily on changing the dynamics to carry listeners through all those different sections, because otherwise you'd be a little confused, because they can all sound like totally different songs if you listen section by section. There are times of thundering booming volume that occur like in the finale, how I showed you, or there's also times of receding volumes as instruments taper off and leave the piano at the focus as it leads the band. So the timbre and tone color can be described as lively and energetic. At times, the fast and unexpected changes in the dynamics of the song could be described as brassy and abrasive, but overall, I think it's a piece that has a rich and complex tone. And there is no word to music relationship to talk about because there are no words in this piece. So form. Critics argue that Rhapsody in Blue is formless, and Pitt Sandberg even wrote that the music is, quote, runs off into empty passage work and meaningless repetition. But others argue, fans of the piece, argue that because it is called a rhapsody, the introduction of these new melodic sections is justified, and that's what makes it such a progressive style. So the time period that Rhapsody in Blue was written in really influenced the work. It was written in the 1920s, which was a time period that brought many changes and advancements in all parts of society, but also and especially in music. This was the time of the Harlem Renaissance, which we learned about was the birthplace of jazz. And Gershwin was one of the first to combine these new elements of the popular music of jazz and the classical form that white audiences were used to. So for a lot of white audiences, this was the first time that they had really heard those jazz elements. Immigration and innovation were also at an all-time high, and it was said that he wanted this piece to also be a reflection of the melting pot of the USA, which in turn would be a reflection on his own upbringing. Because George Gershwin was born the second son to Russian immigrants in Brooklyn, New York. He was born on September 26, 1898, and died when he was only 38 years old on July 11, 1937. He dropped out of school at age 15 and got his first job in the music industry as a song plugger at Tin Pan Alley in New York City, which was a name given to the top music producers of the time. His first song was published when he was only 17 years old, so it was clear that he had a knack for plunking out memorable melodies. In 1919, his first hit really put him on the market, and in 1924, George teamed up with his older brother to become the Gershwin brothers, who would be the top dominant Broadway songwriters of the period. Although his musical compositions from his Broadway works brought him lots of fame and success, he really wanted to do some more serious works as well. He was asked by Paul Whiteman to write an original work for a concert of modern experimental music. George, who was hard at work on his musical comedy Sweet Little Devil, barely completed his work on time. His work was Rhapsody in Blue. It was an instant success when he produced it at the Whiteman concert, and he would go on to write many other well-received orchestral works such as Concerto in F and the Second Rhapsody. He continued to compose until his early death, and sadly was at the height of his career when he passed. His compositional style could be described and was considered progressive and experimental by many in his own time. He effectively combined classical elements with the popular music like jazz and Broadway show tunes as well. And he was a really unique composer in the fact that he was really popular and successful in so many different genres. So his relationship with music was a little different than a lot of other composers that we studied in the course, because he really had a non-traditional upbringing and education in music. I found this really interesting quote by Steve Schwartz, who said that George studied music only haphazardly when it suited his schedule. A remark from Henry Colwell about his teaching Gershwin, counterpoint I find illuminating, is that Gershwin got bored with strict counterpoint and would alter things to get a piquant harmony. In short, he treated classical procedures as means rather than ends, just like other modern composers. Here's some interesting facts about Gershwin that I really enjoyed. He was awarded a special posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 1998, which was the centennial of his birth. He had no real interest in music until he was 10, and he was intrigued by what he heard at a friend's violin recital. Also, one that I find the most interesting is that Gershwin had pretty much forgot that he had agreed to write for Whiteman's concert. He was busy working on the Broadway show that he was working on at the time, and his own brother had to remind him that he had to compose a piece when he saw an ad for George's piece in the newspaper. So he reminded George that he had agreed. George dropped everything that he was doing for the musical and had only 4 weeks to complete his piece, so he barely finished Rhapsody in Blue on time to present at the Whiteman concert. He was handing out changes and new parts to the members of the orchestra just days before the concert, and he improvised his piano solo with only blank pages in front of him for that first premiere of the piece, which is just fascinating, but also kills some big music fans today because we don't have the original solo that he played at that concert because he never had written it down. It was all improvised. Some more interesting facts include that in the 1920s, Gershwin went to Paris and applied to study composition with the noted Nadia Boulanger, who, along with many other tutors, such as Maurice Ravel, rejected him. They were afraid that rigorous classical study would ruin his jazz-influenced style, which I think is super interesting. As I mentioned earlier, he sadly died unexpectedly at age 38 from a brain tumor. And Rhapsody in Blue would go on to become the title of the 1945 fictionalized screen biography of George Gershwin's life. I have not seen it, but I think I'm going to watch it after doing this whole project. Influence today, I think it's really interesting that he was the first to really bring in the popular music form of jazz into a facet of entertainment that more of the population would see. Primarily the white audiences who might not have had an interest for jazz before. He introduced it in the concert halls, saw it for the first time. And I think that that can relate to culture today because we're seeing a new resurgence in interest in jazz. 2 movies that were both heavy award winners and came out in the past couple years, La La Land and Whiplash, both have a storyline that focuses either on jazz music or jazz musicians, and I think that George Gershwin had an influence on that interest that we still have today. And here's my works cited. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about George Gershwin and Rhapsody in Blue.